From the Baltoro Glacier, K2 looks like a perfect pyramid of rock and ice. And on a clear day in late July, dozens of climbers move up the standard route in single file, clipped to fixed ropes, breathing bottled oxygen, guided by elite Sherpas. In 2022, 150 people reached the summit in a single day. It looks from a distance exactly like Everest. That comparison has gotten more people killed on this mountain than almost anything else on its slopes. K2 has killed roughly 1 out of every 10 people who've stood on top of it. On Everest, a mountain 237 meters taller, that number is closer to 1 in 50. Same ropes, same oxygen, same Sherpa support. K2 kills nearly 5 times as many people. So what makes the world's second highest mountain so much more lethal than the first? And what is it about K2 that money, technology, and the world's strongest guides simply cannot fix? K2 sits deep in Pakistan's Karakoram Range, straddling the Chinese border, over 120 kilometers from the nearest road. Reaching base camp requires a week-long trek across some of the most rugged glacial terrain on Earth, without a single lodge, tea house, or cell tower along the way. By the time a climber arrives at 5,300 meters, they've already burned more physical energy than most Everest climbers expend in their entire approach. For decades, K2 attracted only elite, self-sufficient alpinists, the kind of people who understood they were walking into something that might not let them walk back out. Then the commercial guiding industry ran out of room on Everest. Over the past 10 years, expedition companies have expanded into the Karakoram, selling K2 as the next logical step for wealthy clients who've already collected an Everest summit photo. The packages run between $35,000 and $85,000, and they promise what Everest delivers: prefixed ropes, stocked high camps, one-to-one Sherpa support, and enough bottled oxygen to keep a client moving through the death zone. And it makes sense. The photos look similar, the gear is identical, and the Sherpas are the same world-class high-altitude operators. But K2's standard route, the Abruzzi Spur, demands continuous technical climbing on rock and ice at 40 to 60 degrees, up through vertical rock clefts, across complex mixed terrain, and into a final corridor that funnels every single climber directly beneath a wall of unstable glacial ice. On Everest, a Sherpa can physically support a struggling client through the worst sections. On K2, the terrain is too steep for 2 people to stand side by side. When something goes wrong above 8,000 meters on this mountain, the nearest helicopter rescue ceiling is base camp. A broken femur at Camp 2 means being lowered down vertical rock by whatever exhausted teammates happen to still be upright. Pakistan's government issues climbing permits and collects fees. Beyond that, safety enforcement above base camp is essentially non-existent. At the foot of the Abruzzi Spur sits a small stone cairn called the Gilkey Memorial, a mound of rock covered in clattering tin plates, scratched dog tags, and dented kitchen lids, each one bearing the name of someone who died above. The mountain rarely returns intact remains. The upper glacier grinds them up over decades, eventually depositing fragments at the base. The memorial serves as a burial ground for whatever comes down. Every climber preparing to step onto the route walks past it. The Karakoram doesn't follow the Himalayas' relatively predictable monsoon cycle. Storm systems here build in hours, with winds exceeding 100 miles per hour at high camp, the force of a Category 2 hurricane, and summit temperatures dropping below -40 even in summer. The usable weather window is, on a generous reading, a handful of days in late July, if that. Alison Hargreaves stood on the summit of K2 on August 13, 1995, in conditions that were cold but calm. She radioed base camp with a message for her 2 young children. "I am on the highest point of the world, and I love you dearly." Less than an hour later, a storm system collapsed onto the upper mountain without warning. Winds estimated at over 260 kilometers per hour physically lifted Hargreaves and 5 other climbers off the exposed ridge and hurled them down the south face. Her body was never recovered. The storm that killed her was invisible from the summit 60 minutes earlier, but the weather, for all its violence, isn't even close to K2's primary killer. Most people assume the most dangerous part of climbing K2 is the ascent, that the summit is the finish line, and once the hardest terrain is behind them, the rest is a controlled walk down. On K2, the summit is the halfway point, and it's the less dangerous half. For climbers who successfully reach the top, 1 in 6 won't survive the descent, the deadliest walk in mountaineering. By the time a climber stands on the summit, their glycogen stores are gone, their blood oxygen is critically low, and cerebral edema may already be setting in. They then have to navigate the same 60-degree ice slopes and complex rock bands they just fought through, except now their coordination has degraded to the point where a routine mechanical action, unclipping a carabiner from one fixed rope, clipping onto the next, can become fatal. Atanas Skatov had summited 10 of the world's 14 8,000ers. While descending K2's Black Pyramid, he fumbled a carabiner transition between two sections of brand new fixed rope. The ropes held, the anchors were intact. Skatov slipped during the fraction of a second he was unclipped and fell hundreds of meters down the ice face. And falls still account for less of K2's death toll than something entirely invisible. On paper, K2 is 237 meters shorter than Everest. Climbers consistently assume that means less altitude, less thin air, less physiological stress. The assumption is wrong. Because K2 sits significantly farther north, the Earth's atmosphere is thinner here at the same elevation. Barometric pressure at K2's summit drops to roughly 349 hectopascals in summer, barely a third of what exists at sea level. In winter, the effective physiological altitude exceeds 9,000 meters, higher than any point on Everest. The mountain is shorter on a map and taller inside the body. At 8,400 meters, each breath pulls in a third of the oxygen available at sea level. Clinical blood gas studies at this altitude have measured arterial oxygen saturation at 54%. In any hospital on Earth, a patient reading 54% triggers cardiac arrest protocol. On K2, climbers at that saturation are scaling 60-degree ice walls while clipping carabiners with frozen hands. The biological chain that follows is silent and irreversible. The lungs constrict and fill with fluid, high-altitude pulmonary edema. The climber begins drowning in their own blood plasma, coughing pools of clear liquid onto the snow. Simultaneously, oxygen deprivation breaks down the blood-brain barrier and the brain swells against the rigid skull. Motor control dissolves, spatial awareness vanishes, and the cruelest part, the swelling can produce a warm euphoria, a deep certainty that lying down in the snow is not just acceptable, but deeply inviting. The brain, in the process of dying, tells the body everything is fine. Everything covered so far, the storms, the falls, the altitude, still isn't what kills the most people on this mountain. What does is something no climber can control, regardless of skill, budget, or experience. If this is the kind of thing worth having in your feed, subscribing takes 1 second. Here's what every climber has to walk beneath to reach the top. To summit K2 via the standard route, every climber must pass through a narrow couloir at 8,200 meters called the bottleneck. The climbing itself, steep ice at 50 to 60 degrees, is demanding but manageable for anyone who's made it this high. The problem is what hangs directly above it, a massive serac, a fractured wall of glacial ice roughly 300 feet tall, overhangs the bottleneck traverse. This ice is not static. It flows under its own mass, constantly cracking in calving blocks that range from the size of a microwave oven to a commercial building. These blocks fall directly onto the route below without warning, and there is no shelter beneath them and no alternative path around them. Every climber who attempts the summit spends hours traversing directly underneath, fully exposed, with nothing between them and the ice but gravity and chance. And this is where K2 breaks the fundamental contract of mountaineering. On every other major peak, danger correlates with decisions. Climb smarter, read conditions better, hire stronger guides, and the odds improve. Beneath the bottleneck serac, an $85,000 guided expedition carries the exact same survival probability as a solo, unsupported attempt. 10,000 tons of glacial ice does not recognize fixed ropes. It does not differentiate between a world-class alpinist and a first-time commercial client. When it falls, everything beneath it dies. No skill, no expenditure, no amount of physical preparation changes that equation. What makes the commercial era even more dangerous is the traffic. As veteran alpinist Ed Viesters put it, if you get up there and can't go straight back down without standing in a line not moving for an hour, it could kill you. On K2, that hour is spent standing directly beneath a hanging wall of ice. On August 1st, 2008, all of it converged at once. Nearly 24 climbers from multiple international expeditions pushed for the summit on a spectacularly clear morning. Delays in fixing ropes through the traverse created a traffic jam that lasted hours, forcing climbers to stand motionless beneath the serac while their supplemental oxygen drained and their core temperature dropped. Climbers reached the summit dangerously late. As darkness fell, a massive section of the serac calved. The falling ice killed Norwegian climber Rolf Bay instantly and swept away the fixed ropes across the entire traverse. In a single collapse, the only secured path off the upper mountain ceased to exist. Dozens of climbers were stranded above 8,200 meters in pitch darkness, facing 60-degree ice with no safety lines and diminishing oxygen. Gerard McDonnell, a 37-year-old Irish engineer who back in Anchorage, Alaska, was known for playing the bodhran in a local pub band, survived the initial collapse. He spent the night in an open bivouac at -30. The next morning, instead of descending immediately to save himself, McDonnell climbed back into the kill zone. 3 Korean climbers had fallen and become tangled upside down in the severed ropes on the 50-degree ice face. McDonnell worked for hours to free them. While he was still working, a second serac collapse swept him and the climbers he was trying to save off the mountain. The last dispatch he'd sent from base camp read, "Let luck and good fortune prevail, fingers crossed." 11 people died in 48 hours. It remains the deadliest event in K2's history, and nothing about the bottleneck has changed since. The serac is still there. The route still passes beneath it. Every season, commercial operators funnel more clients into the same corridor, increasing the number of bodies beneath the same hanging ice. 15 years later, the bottleneck revealed another dimension of what it does to people. Not geological this time, but moral. On July 27, 2023, Muhammad Hassan, a 27-year-old Pakistani porter, was hired by a budget expedition company to carry rope-fixing equipment into the death zone. He took the job for roughly $800. He needed the money for his sick, diabetic mother and his 3 young children. He climbed without supplemental oxygen, without insulated gloves, without a proper downsuit. While the commercial clients around him wore $1,000 Gore-Tex systems, Hassan ascended the bottleneck in normal trousers and a jacket. At 2:30 in the morning, on the narrowest section of the traverse, Hassan slipped. He fell several meters and was left hanging upside down from the fixed line, his outer jacket sliding up to expose his bare torso to -20-degree winds. Drone footage captured what happened next. A continuous line of headlamps, climber after climber, stepping over his body and continuing upward. Hassan hung there for over 3 hours before he died. His body remained on the mountain for a full year before it was recovered. He had been smiling in team photos taken hours earlier. After all of that, K2 sounds unsurvivable. The numbers paint a more complicated picture, but not a reassuring one. The death-to-summit ratio was closer to 1 in 4 before the commercial era. The modern 9.5% represents a genuine statistical drop, but that drop is almost entirely a function of volume. Commercial expeditions have pushed record numbers of people to the summit during rare weather windows, 200 summits in 2022 alone. The denominator inflated rapidly. The serac didn't change, the barometric pressure didn't change, the storms didn't change, the mountain didn't get safer. More people simply got through. Compared to other 8,000-meter peaks, K2 remains roughly 4 to 5 times deadlier than Everest. Only Annapurna and Nanga Parbat carry comparable fatality rates. Fewer than 1,000 people have ever stood on K2's summit, fewer than the graduating class of a single large high school. 92 of them are dead. One genuinely positive development is the caliber of the Sherpa teams now operating on the mountain. Their technical skill has improved route preparation and emergency logistics at the lower camps considerably, but above Camp 4, above the shoulder, in the shadow of the serac, no amount of logistics changes the equation. K2 is not getting safer, it's getting more popular, and that gap is where people continue to die. For anyone seriously considering K2, the margin between surviving and not comes down to a handful of decisions made before the summit push begins. Set an absolute turnaround time and treat it as non-negotiable. Most descent fatalities happen to climbers who summited after 2 or 3 in the afternoon, entering the descent in darkness on empty reserves. If the summit isn't reachable by early afternoon, the climb is over. Proximity to the top is not a reason to continue. Carry a pulse oximeter and check it obsessively above 7,000 meters. Hypoxia degrades cognitive function before the impairment is noticeable from the inside. If oxygen saturation drops sharply, or if walking a straight line becomes difficult, cerebral edema is setting in. The only treatment is immediate descent. No drug cures it, no amount of rest at altitude reverses it. Carry dexamethasone and nifedipine on the body, not in a Sherpa's pack that can be separated. These drugs don't fix altitude illness. They buy a narrow window of neurological clarity to get lower. Move through the bottleneck at first light before the sun has had time to work on the serac's fracture lines. Every additional hour of warmth expands meltwater in those cracks, increasing the probability of a calving event, and there is no partial exposure. Once the traverse begins, the only direction is through. And the one most climbers are worst at following. Be willing to abandon the summit entirely. 37% of K2's victims had already reached the top when the mountain killed them. The summit is not the finish line. Getting home is.